song is dedicated to Frederick Stiegel. The motto is, the buck stops here. And the interpretation is, he had to go to war, oh boy. And when he got back, the folks were old and the farm needed attention. There wasn't much chance to go to town and change himself. So he just kept on growing with the farm. And now the folks are gone, and there's just the farm. And so it's unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely, that any girl will marry the farm. Fred and the farm. The buck stops here. These are songs about the Corn Belt and some of the people in it, or on it. At this point, Ida, steering by the stars and wondering again about why they came to be together, checking always left and right, remembering the old jokes like, your problem, Sheriff, is you're famous. My what? And it's such a lonely job. Well, you picked it. You could have been employed like your father, etc., etc. Underneath the windows and up against the doors, the drift whiteness stretches out in all directions. Inside, the landscape of attachments only as in. She says they come in two forms. One's a sort of wrapper, the layer of something over the layers that we put on, and most often, strangely, noticeable when the top layer we put on is belted. The other form is most like lint. Quote her in her own words, quote, in a certain kind of light, a piece of something on a person's clothing, unquote. Gosh, how scary. Now seated at evening, she faces due east, i.e. place and space, and still a flux in time. He, on the other hand, that is, her right, faces pure north, i.e. set in time and totally adrift in space. I'll jolt the lamp, 9 p.m. Gosh, they have done this forever. A typical two-shot with dialogue. She says, well, how's your day today? He says, it was too much for me. She says, at the risk of everything, what's the answer? He says, I've been practicing how to say it right the first time. She says, could you give me a for instance? He says, one says, when I see those birds in cages, I know they're sad. Two says, that's a mistake. Birds don't get sad. That's just the way they look when they can't fly. One says, wisely, well, that's what sadness is. Pause. She says, why do people live in such conditions? Well, long pause. He says, to get away from leaders, Ida. He says, have you seen the headlines? He says, besides the note, we found 2 buttons, almost like a clue. One said, indifference, misspelled. The other said, mind over ... She says, you mean i.e., who are they? He says, what we know is she lives in town and he's been here before. What we don't know is how they spend their time apart. He says, why do we do these things? He says, I think the answer is names. We do things to test power of names. He says, renames. Could you give me a, for instance? He says, Raoul de Noger, my fingers, Hussein de Montmorency. Those are names. He says, you look tired, Will. Could you take a day off? He says, I'm like the mayor of the trailer park. It's true. I count 5, but I know there are 4. He says, well, Will, where did the money go? He says, somewhere out of town and back. She says, is the courier one of us? He says, do you mean one of the explorers? She says, yes. He says, well, someone knows the ropes. She says, who are the 4? Will? He says, 1, the mastermind, whose connection is somebody local with a European name. 2, his buddy, whose origins are not local, who by our standards may not have origins at all. 3, some local woman with a European name, and the 4th is an insider. She says, who is the 5th then? He says, I keep counting 5, but it must be in my imagination. She says, how does romance fit in, Will? He says, mainly it takes time. It keeps them here. It's something that you just outgrow. She says, what's expected of you then? He says, do you mean as a citizen? She says, yes. He says, only that you act out possibilities. She says, and are those attached to you? He says, yeah, for instance, that you might be a pitcher. Smoke it by him and die young, the best of both worlds. No one's will. She says, is this something you talk about among yourselves? He says, no, you know, too noisy in the daytime, especially when you're moving, and at night everybody's too tired. She says, so how do people get the news? He says, like food on the run. In the situation we're in now, you don't read, you look. He says, are there examples of self-denial? He says, yeah, for instance, when two people own, say, 15 chairs in common, that cuts into your sitting downtown. He says, what are the side effects, Will? Pause. He says, zero. Everything's up front. He says, are there things going on that one can't see? He says, well, retirement has its dangers. Things definitely happen at night. He says, like. He says, like those things you notice in the morning. He says, is that inevitable? He says, only after you start noticing. He says, there must be a positive way of thinking of it. He says, either it's something that's not permanent or it's something that just takes getting used to. She says, what happens when the children get together? Long pause. He says, they tell jokes. She says, that's better than breaking bottles, isn't it? Long pause. He says, depends on the joke. She says, is there enough work for everyone? He says, well, we encourage repetition. There are no limits on what a human being can do. Take the example of the minorities. She says, how do you measure things like that? He says, endurance mainly. Keep on coming back. She says, again, can you give me a for instance? He says, well, for instance, there was a man who remembered everything. They finally had to lock him up. He says, I suppose there are tricks of the imagination. He says, yeah, things are bound to get off sometimes. She says, are there qualities that you discourage? Long pause. He says, short sounds and flags. He says, are there other kinds of limits? He says, we only count what you can accomplish when you're concentrated, or when you're smiling, or when you're doing your best. He says, is that a matter of economy? He says, well, in the old days, you might cry in the kitchen to realize there wouldn't be another fresh tomato for a year. That's all changed now. He says, so what form do ideas take? And are there other groupings? He says, well, your eye's still smart. And in the music, if we break it down by sevens, we get, excuse me.
One more time. 5, 7, 8, 7,
It can be broken down further, at least to the month, maybe even to the day. I admit the understanding frightens me a little. Right now, I'm most interested in conjunctions. 15, 35, and 50. The next one comes up soon. Look out. He keeps saying look out to himself. He'll be standing by the stove, making coffee, and he'll say, look out. She says, why do people swear? He says, the thing itself is called Tourette syndrome, named for Gilles de la Tourette. Keep in mind he's French. One unnamed thinks it errs on Gilles' right for breaking into language, where in other times he would have suffered mere hallucinations. My theory is that it's just exploration, as in, why does everybody hum except for assholes and everybody doesn't sing? This way assumes that things are more or less okay except for drives, as in the gradients between the Sunday drive and the South Pole issue. Keeps the playwrights on their toes. In this theory, the important element is, quote, the opportunity, unquote. For instance, only yesterday I decided for myself, no more incidental music. As soon as I made this plan, the phone rang. The voice said, there's money in it for you. I restrained myself from saying hot diggity. Instead, I said, oh boy. I'm totally, exclusively, completely, and only into, as they say, song. Who's going to write the words? The voice said, well, what we had in mind was something more abstract. I said, do you mean as in music that supports action that is unexplained? The voice said, yes. I said, do you mean I find music for my own motives, and while that music is performed, people in costumes will jump around on stage? The voice said, that's more or less the idea. I said, fuck you, man. Next time you're in the bathroom, hang yourself. That's what I mean by the element of, quote, opportunity, unquote. He says, does this happen often? He says, well, people on TV say I just went blank. He says, how does that affect you? He says, I never believed there was such a thing. Then I realized there are people who will say, if you order that fish, you have to eat it. So my ideas keep changing. She says, is it possible there was no money to begin with? He says, anything's possible. But the fact is, for one whole day it was gone, and then it was there, and then it was gone, and then it was back unchanged. She says, are you investigating the chances of an inside job? He says, if we're holding this together, all jobs are inside jobs. She says, then he decides what's acceptable. He says, almost any amount is acceptable. It almost always happens between words. Words explain the stage business. Pantomime is a special case. It suppresses words, therefore can tell us only what we know already. It's probably the oldest of all ideas. He says, but where is the resistance? He says, only in the name, he would say, not Gibbon, Gibbons. Gibbons the baboon. I didn't think there was a difference except in sound, but that's the way he wanted it. She says, how did you get to know each other? He says, I crawled into her room at night. She says, how did you get out? He says, she'd be down the rain pipe mostly, but one time her father caught me and I had to jump. He says, is there anything you call therapy? He says, just a good long walk. He says, what are the kinds of feelings are described? He says, there's a feeling that the other is voracious, that you are in the presence of some devouring force the other is the instrument of, and there is a feeling of resentment against that force. She says, would you call this an alienation? He says, this is truly a nation of aliens, not the only one, but probably the biggest, so I guess we would call it an alienation. A friend of mine says it's not a nation at all, that they're all aliens. He points, as for instance, to the red man, as he calls himself, patient, modest in his ambitions, and apparently just a visitor from Asia. He says, and what about the public property? Sigh. He says, that's a hard one. All I can say is, in the morning, some tiptoe and some don't. Sigh. She says, and what about the, quote, mysteries, unquote? He says, it's greed that the main cause is our, quote, wearing out, unquote, and, quote, getting in an accident, unquote. But I think that everybody's worried now about the telephone. She says, what kinds of tests do you use? He says, there's, quote, prayer, unquote, of course. But just because we have it, we don't have to do it always. dependence means a loss of sensitivity. I don't want us to get cruder and not pray. I want us just to practice waiting, because I feel that we could receive a message and be ready to pray. He says, and how is music related to all this? He says, well, unlike movies, which is a corporate idea, or an example of a corporate idea, here there is no plan to speak of. One flake follows the next, each is slightly different, and first thing you know, you've got a pile, like that pile over there. Here today, gone tomorrow, only to be replaced by something else we need. But in the movies, or the corporate idea, take two is the main approach, up to and including the thing itself intact. When you finish the movie, you show it to the person who's in charge of opinion, and you listen to his opinion, which is judgment. This approach is pure in that the flaw in the aesthetic structure, that is, the certainty that opinion is random. That opinion has no bounds or limits. But finally, under the pressure of opinion, the work would never be completed, is answered, not in apologies to opinion, which would only weaken opinion as a standard, nor in the option of another kind of structure, for instance, that the maker of opinion should have some notion about what to do, but in the logic of, if logic is the word, the relativism of opinion, that is, the answer to a bad opinion is to assert that, finally, opinion is nothing. People respect this idea. For instance, a teacher once said to me when I told him I had never had a favorable opinion about the products of the Chrysler Motor Company, and could he understand that? He said, yes, that's what sells cars. She says, and who do you think was in on the plan? He says, as I said, the mastermind, the CD-looking older guy, there's no doubt the Mexican is in it. Doubt is if he's Mexican. Then there are the locals. There's somebody, not unlike RD, somebody who works at the bank and has access to the inner secrets. Then there's somebody connected to that connection in some way, maybe even an older sister, like Maria Solda, who was the communicator. Then there were some involved in travel, innocent of what they were up to, maybe like those two kids that went off yesterday and eloped. Maybe there were others, but I don't think so. I think that's it. She says, how is it that you know about the elopement?
Pause.
He says, the clipping service. She says, I would believe then that sometime 2 nights ago someone,
Remember G.
knowing that the sound code to open the safe is somehow embedded in.
Oh my, we should have to use that word in this connection.
A telephone call to the bank manager from the diner as in the call. The whole town knows his wife makes sometimes.
It has to be something that he says or thinks.
Arranged another call or took advantage of another call to make a recording to open the safe and then secreted the money in some place purely dangerous, as for instance, a moving vehicle of unknown destination for a period of time, more or less, as in, say, music, and then replaced the money after showing the whole world that was missing. He says yes. And more than that, that person sent the message about the location of the missing money in the form of the message that it was missing, i.e., about 12:45, we got a call for an accident out on the highway. Also at 12:45, we got a call about 2 dogs fighting at the bank, but we had this accident out on the highway to take care of, and nobody was, to our knowledge, getting hurt at the bank. So we put off the dispatch. He says, was that a good choice? He says, there wasn't any accident out on the highway. She says, we are to believe then that the dogfight was an excuse, a performance, a version, that the accident of the water thrown on the bank manager. She said, I remember now, it stopped his motion but left his passion totally intact, i.e. GP. Was no accident at all.
Well, it wasn't on the highway.
But this was done to cause the manager to go in to the safe for a change of clothes in order to discover that the bank had no money in the bank. He says yes. She says, who would know that his change of clothes was in the safe? He says, he's the Boy Scout master after all. She says, Can you believe the dog would stoop to such a thing? He says, well, Ida, it's hard.
Oh, Donnie.
Such as the music is, such are the people of the Commonwealth. Oh, boy. One, no,
One, two, three, four, five, T, 7, 8, M1, 10, recess, difficulties, 14, 15, M2, football, back seat, 21, 22, M3, recess, or difficulties, 28, 29, M4, the room, confusion, 35, 36, M5, systems, outside, 42, 43, M6, the city, food, 49, 50, M7, the end, or 5, T, the home, smells, 10, D, manhood, guns, 15, B, business, thrills, 20, D, the flaw in him, 25, G1, sleep and words, 30, G2, the young marrieds, confusion, problems, 35, H, questions of things, 40, N, consciousness, 2, never heals, 45, P, third party feelings, second, thoughts, 50, S, the transfer,